Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank the Cato Institute not just for this event. Michael spent time reviewing and looking over the comments, discussing some ideas with me. And in fairness to him, I have to say he doesn't agree with everything that's in the book. Also, Chris Brebel here did a lot on the national security chapters, and the same caveat applies. They were part of the whole process of bringing this together. When I look at the budget process and the political system that we're in, we have an entitlement mentality that is bankrupting America today, but it's not the entitlement mentality that most conservatives and Republicans talk about. It's not that people want free handouts and aren't willing to pay for it. It's not that people want more government than they're willing to pay for. It's that the political class wants more government than most Americans are willing to pay for. And the entitlement mentality that is bankrupting us is a group of people who feel they're entitled to rule over the rest of us. They have been driving policy here in a direction for a long time that has created a fiscal crisis. The last time government spending went down from one year to the next in America was 2 years before I was born. And just for clarification, that wasn't in the Clinton era or even the Nixon era. Dwight Eisenhower was in office back then. We've had 5 Republican presidents since Eisenhower, 5 Democrats, all of whom have seen spending go up every single year. And it's because they have simply ignored voter sentiment. Now, when you talk about polling, I think it's important to track the day-to-day stuff. And Sean and Michael do a great job of picking apart the demographic trends and what it means for this coming election or what it means for the overall balance of power. I have a more skeptical view, and I can explain it best this way. I'm a New York Giants football fan. So when the Redskins play the Cowboys, I want them both to lose. And there's a lot of Americans that when the Republicans play the Democrats, they want them both to lose. They're not happy with the alternatives. And so when you look at the day-to-day tracking polls, it's important, and I do think every literate person should go to RasmussenReports.com at 9:30 every morning to see the daily presidential tracking poll. But that's like if you can picture a river in a heavy rainstorm. And on the surface, there's all kinds of turmoil and bouncing around and splashing around. Those are the daily tracking polls. And they're interesting and fun to watch. But if you go a foot beneath the surface, you don't even know it's raining. And you find a deep current that is moving in the same direction. And as I started writing about the budget, I was trying to find those deep currents because what you see in American history is that public opinion moves before political action. We were all taught that the shot heard around the world in 1775 started the revolution. Actually, public opinion shifted in the 1760s and 1770s. There were catalyst events that we all learn about as legend now, the Stamp Act and the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. And eventually this one event at Lexington started a revolution. And what's really important to note about this is the political leaders didn't rally people behind that cause. Thomas Jefferson didn't articulate the public view until 15 months later. So the public opinion came first, then there was a catalyst, and then a political leader articulated the public mood. And this happens again and again. On December 1st, 1955, a young woman refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks did not start the civil rights movement. She was the catalyst. And we know in this case that it was public opinion that shifted first because she had done the same thing 12 years earlier and nothing happened. Public opinion needed to move. It took Martin Luther King to articulate those attitudes. It took Martin Luther King to challenge the nation to live up to the ideals of its founding, but that came afterwards. And by the time Congress acted, Americans supported the Civil Rights Act by a 2-to-1 margin. And so right now we're at a point where voters have been frustrated about fiscal policies for more than 50 years. Spending has gone up every year, and they voted to elect politicians who promised, every president and most members of Congress elected in the last half century have said they would cut spending. But it doesn't happen. And that frustration began to boil over with the Tea Party, and it's now looking for other outlets and other ways to say to the political class, something is wrong. We hate the bailouts, and yet we're going to have 2 presidential nominees who both supported the bailouts. How does that happen in a society that is supposed to be representative? When you begin to get to the federal budget itself, first thing that's important to note is that the deficit is not $15 trillion. Michael estimates it at $120 trillion. The Obama administration is much more optimistic. They say it's only about $70 trillion. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Those are huge numbers. And the reason we have the discrepancy is when government spending began to tick up in an unsustainable manner in the 1960s, we had politicians who knew that wouldn't go down well with the voters. So rather than try to address the underlying problems, they began a cover-up. And again, this was the era of Nixon, and we did learn that cover-ups are worse than the crime. They redefined budget terminology to hide the growth of spending for 50 years. And it's finally reached a point where that's all breaking down. Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson initiated programs that provided benefits to their constituents and would be paid for by a future generation. We are that future generation. Now, in terms of what voters think, when I try to take a look at those deeper currents that are going on in the country right now, voters are not looking for handouts. They're willing to make hard choices much more than their political leaders are. They believe, for example, on Social Security, what they were told, that you pay something during your working years and you get it back in your retirement years. They believe there is supposed to be a trust fund so that money can't be used for anything else. And they're not looking for a handout on Social Security. They're looking for the payback that they were promised. They want those choices and trade-offs to be made real. But maybe the best area to see the difference is not on entitlements, because that gets kicked around all the time. It's in national security. And remember that a majority of all federal spending goes to three areas: national security, Social Security, and Medicare. If you pay those items, plus interest on the debt, and you do nothing else, we're still running a deficit. So you've got to tackle those areas if you want to talk about spending. In national security, we have commitments around the globe to provide military assistance to 56 countries. So at Rasmussen Reports, we went out and polled the American people about should we provide military assistance to each of these countries. Only 12 made the grade. Most Americans are saying we should not be providing military assistance to places like France and other long-term allies. By a 2-to-1 margin, they are saying it is time to bring troops home from Western Europe and Japan. And these attitudes do not reflect isolationism. They are not reflected by any of the presidential candidates in this year's election. This year, running for president, we have Ron Paul, who pretty much is saying you need to blame America first. We are the cause of the problems internationally. That is a view the American people do not accept. You have other Republican candidates who say we need to spend more on national security, also not a view that the American people accept. And then you have President Obama, who's saying we need to trim the budget but get involved in more interventions, also something that voters don't accept. 75% of voters today agree with Ronald Reagan's view that we should never send U.S. troops anywhere unless vital national security interests are at stake. And in most places that we're involved in today, voters aren't seeing that. Now, this is also a great area to talk about that polls can give you a sense of where the public is. The public is willing to make changes. And the way I describe it succinctly is they don't want to blame America first. They don't want to send Americans first into battle. They just want our military to protect America first. But having said that, polls are not the way you make national security decisions on a day-in, day-out basis. What is needed is a political leader who can tap into these public opinions and provide a scenario, a framework for people to evaluate things. At the beginning of the Cold War, Dwight Eisenhower said there are forces of good and evil. There's massed armies facing each other on the borders, and that was a framework that people could accept. Nobody today is explaining in a coherent manner how we deal with clashing civilizations, what it means to have the Islamic world rising up the way that it is and their opposition to the United States. Where do we have U.S. interests? What are our real interests? That is a discussion that needs to be had. And if that discussion is held, all the polling data I've just mentioned to you will shift somewhat. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the end result would be a more restrained policy of military intervention and a significantly lower level of international involvement for U.S. military forces. Only 11% of Americans want us to be the world's policemen. These ideas are not even being talked about. I think the last presidential candidate to talk about bringing troops home from Western Europe was Dwight Eisenhower. He would be appalled that we're still there today. The attitudes that we're seeing in national security matters are that the United States is a force for good in the world, but that doesn't mean we have to get involved in every single squabble in every corner of the globe. When you move from that to these other issues, you see similar kinds of attitudes and discussions. Voters want to have credible alternatives. And since there's a little discussion about health care down the road in the Supreme Court today, I'll just throw something in on that too. When people look at Medicare, they are not looking at something that you're going to fix as a budget program. They believe that you have to fix the underlying cost of delivering health care. Most voters are looking for more choice, not less, because they believe competition will drive prices down. More choice, even to the extent of saying, if your employer pays for your health insurance, you should be able to use that money to pick your own insurance plan. And if you find one that maybe covers less procedures or has a higher deductible and cost less, that's okay. It's your choice. You should be able to keep the change if you're saving money. That's a radically different idea than is being talked about in the president's health care plan or in any of the options that are out there. What I think is driving the health care debate and makes me absolutely certain that the president's law will be overturned either by the court or by this year's elections or by public reaction down the road is there are three big trends that make the status quo unsustainable. The first is that if you went back 50 years ago, the average American spent 3.6% of their disposable income on health care out-of-pocket costs. Today, it's down to 2.7%. So we're hearing all this rhetoric of the rising costs, but people are paying a smaller share of their income for out-of-pocket medical care costs. Why is that? It's because in 1960, insurance covered only half of all health care bills. The only way you're going to restrain the cost is to make a greater alignment between the people who are making the decisions about the kind of care they receive and the people who are paying the bills. Second big trend in health care is that we spend twice as much money on medical care today as we do on food. And yet, any medical expert will tell you that you could do more to improve the health of Americans by having them eat better, make better lifestyle choices, and exercise better than you can by any amount of spending on medical coverage. Sooner or later, that system has to change. It cannot be sustained in the way it is. If you're a lower income family and part of your grocery budget is being taken up because somebody can't pay you more because of the health bills, you're actually having your health damaged by the existing system. And the final thing that's bringing this up right now is the president's health care law. I have great respect for what the president did in terms of raising this issue. It's hurting his political popularity. It's hurting his chances for re-election. But at least he had the nerve to put something big on the table and address a real issue. Paul Ryan did the same thing. He also got burned in this process. In January of 2011, just before Paul Ryan put forth his plan, Republicans were trusted more than Democrats on health care by a 14-point margin. After Paul Ryan's plan came out, it's dead even. So these are people, even if you disagree with their policies, at least they're talking about a significant issue, and that is hastening the change that's coming. And when you start talking about particular numbers and budgets and details, it can get pretty numbing. In the book, there are proposals that eventually, if they were all implemented exactly as they are written in the book, would reduce our total debt by about $100 trillion over a decade. First of all, I know that they will never be implemented as they are in the book. This is a beginning of a discussion, not the end. But change like that is hard to imagine. And yet I know it's coming because public opinion has already made the shift. And the reason that we just can't foresee the scope of change because we can't picture the details. If I was standing here in 1978 talking about a new cable network like ESPN or CNN, and I described to you accurately what's going to happen and what would happen in the next decade, you would have laughed at me. I would have said things like the major television networks that at that point had 90% of the audience would be struggling for their lives, and that television stations would be starting to lose money, and that the shows that were cut because they didn't have a big enough audience in 1979 would be the largest audience on network television 10 years later. It wasn't just that industry. If I was here 20 years ago today talking about the impact of the internet on newspapers, you would have laughed at me. And we are now at that kind of a sea change. Something is going to be a catalyst. The bailouts were a start of it. Something else may come along. It may be a presidential candidate who says, I want to take on not just the entitlement side of spending, but also the military. It may be a fluke event that we can't predict. But when that catalyst occurs and when the change happens, the political class in Washington won't know what hit them. It'll be over before it even begins. Thank you very much.